All right. We have our next presenter, Arianne Kok, who will be talking about her thesis in Envisioning Sustainability, exploring college students' visions of the future for her thesis advisor. And her leader is Arianne Kok.
All right. So before I get started, I just want to give a huge thank you to my advisor, Jason. This project literally would not exist without help. And also to my reader, Andy, thank you for your feedback on my draft. And yeah, let's get into it. So I really got into this topic because I love stories. I'm also an English major and I grew up on stories. I think we interact with stories maybe more than we realize. When we're reading the news, we're reading about a story that somebody's telling about something. And we can really use stories to enhance the way that we're thinking about things. So recently there's been a rise of something called cli-fi, which is climate fiction, essentially which tries to use fiction and stories to get people to care about the environment and about climate change. So parable so is a very popular one, you guys may have heard of it. But when we read stories in the news, especially about the future, they tend to paint a more negative picture. So you might have heard like, okay, well, we think that there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. So we're setting this kind of future date and saying, you know, something awful might happen if we don't change our behavior now. And this messaging can be pretty negative and can make us feel worried or anxious and even immobilize us and make us feel like we can't do anything to fix the problem. So, oh, I did that. There we go. Okay, so envisioning is what this is called, where you're kind of imagining the future in a certain way. And this has been done by some really large organizations like the UN or different companies like Shell, where we're essentially kind of planning for the future by imagining what might exist there and how to get there, you know, what might have to change. So something like a climate zero plan where a company is trying to reduce their impact. That's kind of an example of envisioning where we're imagining the future. You might have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, it's a very common example. But what's kind of missing is engaging the general public in this conversation. So asking people, you know, that are not in these huge organizations or in giant companies, what they're thinking about, what they're concerned about. So that's kind of something that I was very interested in. But why would we do that at all? You might know that climate change and its associated issues are very complex. There is no one way to solve this issue. It's not as simple as just writing a law that's going to fix it all. So it's a complex problem and therefore requires, honestly, several creative solutions. And I kind of mentioned that, but when people feel really immobilized and unhopeful about the future, they might not want to act to fix these issues. So by creating hope and getting people to feel excited about the future, excited about a positive future that they actually want to live in, we can actually get people to act. So who do we focus on this? A lot of science research is focused on young people, so Gen Z, but also millennials, because obviously they're people that are going to live longest into the future and maybe see the worst effects of climate change. But also people in college that are kind of being exposed to new ways of thinking, or you know, thinking about careers. They want to do a career in environmental science or sustainability. So it's a very pivotal time for people and kind of a time where you can change the way people think and get them to be excited about the future. Good question. I was really curious, how do young people envision the future? What are they seeing? What are they feeling? How are they kind of picturing this? Are they hopeful? Are they not hopeful? So I used two methods to kind of tackle this. The first was a survey. It was an online survey distributed to U of M students through social media and LinkedIn and some email lists. So it's kind of a convenient sampling method. But after some screening of like times and stuff, we had about 75 respondents. And then at the end of the survey, I asked people if they wanted to participate in an interview. And I had 21 people say that they were interested, which was amazing. So I got to talk to 21 people for about 15 to 45 minutes each about their views for the future. And I'll go into a little bit about what I asked specifically. But so within the survey, the first few questions were kind of general demographics and background. So, you know, age, gender, race, but also how many environmental courses they've taken, how concerned they were about climate change, things like major, things like that, to kind of get a sense of the group that we were looking at. And then it really went into what I'm calling the most likely scenarios for the future. So asking them, like, giving them basically a question bank with a bunch of scenarios for the future and asking them, how likely do you think this is to exist in the future? So my advisor and I, we came up with these 5 kind of categories that frame things in an easier way. So we can touch on some of the main important factors with, climate change and environmental issues, but keep it, pretty simple. And we use these categories too in the interviews to keep things simple and able to compare between the survey and interview. So you can see them up here, but technology, transportation, food, waste, and then well-being, which can kind of be split into physical and mental well-being. So, like I said, here's an example with the transportation category of a scenario that we gave people. So electric vehicles are replacing gas-powered vehicles. And then the respondent would look at that and kind of, say how likely they think that is to be true in the future in the US in 2050. So that way it kind of frames it too, because it can, places all across the world might look very differently in the future. So, and then 2050 gives people kind of a general date to work towards. So, and then another example about waste, our businesses using sustainable business practices to kind of minimize their impact. How likely do people believe that this is to be true in the future? So this is some examples. And to go into the results of the survey first, these were the 3 highest endorsed scenarios, or the ones that people thought were most likely in the future. There was a huge consensus. So basically, 7 from 0 to 7, the higher number being more likely. Extreme events being common and causing people to be displaced was the most common scenario for the future that people thought. The second was that people were very anxious about the world, very worried, very, not very certain about their state, their place in the future. And then the last one was about electrical grid stress and more power outages, so kind of like a shaky energy system, was the 3rd highest endorsed. And then what's also interesting is the ones that were the lowest endorsed. So which ones did people not believe were going to be true in the future? People did not think that air travel was going to be rare in the future. It was kind of something that, was one for maybe holding on to a little bit more. The idea of frugality, or only buying what you need and not buying what you want, is also not very endorsed. And then lastly, less long distance travel. So kind of same as the air travel, but that people kind of stay close to home and they don't really make those big trips. That was not something that people really interview. I'll kind of walk through some of the questions that I asked, the general structure of the interview. These were definitely my favorite part of this research. I thought it was so fun to kind of sit down with people and really dive deep into what they were thinking about. It was very open-ended, so I kind of let them just address the question however they wanted to answer it. But the first question was, how are you feeling about the future of the environment? So as you can imagine, this was often not super positive, but kind of related to climate change and issues like that. How are people feeling? And then we kind of went into the biggest chunk of it, which was describing their best case scenario for the future. So the surveys really kind of talked about the most likely scenarios, and then the interviews went into the best scenarios. Again, this is very open-ended. So let's describe to me what you're thinking about the future. I asked them what's coming to mind first. So people have different interests and stuff, obviously, so they can kind of take it whichever direction that they want. And then I went through each of those 5 categories to prompt some more thinking, and again have that like point of comparison between the survey activities. And then lastly, I asked them, I asked them, how do we get there? So how do we go from where we are now to this best case scenario future if we were to get there? Is it going to be companies or governments, or is it going to be like a bottom-up approach that gets us from now to the best case scenario future? Lastly, I asked them, how hopeful are you for that best case scenario? Do you think that that's actually going to be a possibility? When do you think it's going to be a possibility? Do you see it happening at all? So that was a very nice question to do. But I'm going to use the same kind of 2 categories to share some of the results from the interview. So here's one of the responses from a respondent. So they can see extended sidewalks becoming more common, and bike highways, and having kind of cars as a less transportation source. So that was kind of one of the visions for the future relating to transportation. And then relating to waste, this person wanted to remove styrofoam packing peanuts and have better landfill and recycling systems. And they specifically said that if we did this, it would solve some of the issues that we're kind of facing. You can kind of see where people are moving through the question and answering based on what they believe might be true. And these responses are very based on people's perception and knowledge, and also the stories that they've been told. So the thing with visions of the future is that it's very influenced by your knowledge, your education, your perceptions, and then, like I said, sort of the people exposed to. But lastly, in terms of hope, this is a very interesting question too, because I really did think that most people would be less hopeful about the future, especially environmentally focused people. But you can see here, it's not always cut and dry like that. So this person said that they were optimistic in some ways, but that they've actually seen some of the effects of climate change happen, have to evacuate their house twice. So again, it's your experiences that affect kind of how you're moving through life and envisioning the future. So kind of some overall results and themes. This is, I mean, as Jason mentioned, this is a glimpse into the results that we found. But over the survey and interviews, there was an overwhelming idea that the existence of climate change makes people worried and anxious, and kind of have worsened well-being. So the idea that if we solve climate change, if we get to that best case scenario future where climate change is no longer a problem, well-being is going to go up. So people are going to be healthier, people are going to be less anxious, people are not going to be as worried about their, place in the world. But not everyone's unhopeful for this to actually be a scenario, this best case scenario future. So like I said, that was very eye-opening for me because it's pretty much split half and half between people that were hopeful and then still unhopeful for the future. Technological changes were easier for people to imagine. So this kind of makes sense because I think we do kind of place an emphasis on technology as something that can solve issues for us. So there's kind of system-wide changes rather than personal behavior changes. One of the examples that I've come up with is the government kind of imposing renewable energy as the standard rather than people kind of moving to off-the-grid houses and doing that themselves, so reducing their energy use on their own. Similar to that, the visions that were kind of more similar to how life exists today were easier for people to imagine. Those are the ones that they higher endorsed and the ones that kind of came up more in the best case scenario future. So a good example for that is, I think we live in a very consumer society today. So we're purchasing a lot, we're kind of buying what we want, to show status and to show our wealth and stuff. So the idea that frugality is going to be a thing in the future was less endorsed than kind of having the same kind of consumer society. And the last thing was the idea that we need to engage everyone to solve this problem. There was that question, like, how do we get there? How do we get to the best case scenario future? We need people from the bottom up. We need people from governments. We need people from companies. We need kind of everyone tackling this problem at once. Because like I said, there's just not one solution to it. What are the implications? How does this kind of move the conversation forward about climate action? There's this notion that when you educate people about climate change and environmental issues, they'll do more to act against it. That's not necessarily true. It's not enough. When you tell people about these issues, maybe they do care more, think about it more, but it's not enough to get them to act. And in some cases, it might get them to be so, anxious about the future that they don't do anything at all because it's like, okay, well, if the world can't end anyway, why would I do anything? So I think there's a really huge space to engage people in a new creative way. Like I said, I think stories are huge, and I think getting people to think like on the right brain side, getting people to kind of imagine scenarios in the future rather than telling them what they have to do, involving them in that conversation is going to be really important. And I think universities are a huge important space for this because, like I said, people are kind of thinking about things in new ways in college, and young people are thinking about things. And so kind of having those education spaces be a space for this formative, creative thinking where people can see themselves in this future and imagine that in a better way is going to be really interesting. But also not just limited to young people. I think in the communities, not just limited to universities either. So in our communities, we can use this to get people to act in ways that they might not have before because they're in different ways. We need collaboration, like I said, from all sides. And that means not just young people. So I would love to do this research and ask these questions to pretty much any other group of people. You could ask old people this, you could ask elementary students this, you could ask people from different socioeconomic statuses, people from people that are super concerned about the environment, people that don't care at all, or are climate change deniers. You could ask them this question: what do you see for the future? So I think there's a lot of different spaces that you can go with this. Slides. That was my presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So this is the end of your sample population.
Yeah.
For the environment. Like
Yeah.
that's actually. You think it's trying to be.
Definitely. So that's definitely one of the biggest limitations, I think, of this study. They were all U of M students and they were all pretty much very concerned about climate change. Most were white, most came from a kind of relatively wealthy background. So you definitely cannot apply these results to everyone, let alone all young people or let alone all college students. So that's why I think it would be interesting to ask these questions to anyone else. I mean, any other university where maybe climate change is like not a part of the conversation. So but I do think it's interesting to think about, okay, these are very environmentally concerned individuals. Are they helpful? Are they not? So I think, I don't know, like I said, when you're taking all these environmental classes, it tends to be more negative messaging and negative teaching. So I still think it's interesting to kind of look at, okay, well, these are the people that might go into careers with environmental science. Are they helpful? Are they working towards this in a positive way? Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's definitely one of the bigger limitations that we face with.
First is talk about in your survey, it might have sounded like an on gathering information about what those features be like, and I'm wondering if you ever kind of said it to what people wanted.
Right.
And the second piece is you mentioned that those have this kind of skepticism for some personalized solutions for climate change.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, again, it sounded like a lot of conversations on one or individual survey responses, do any sort of collaborative reasoning exercise, either, you with the one that you kind of ripping on each other or in the sort of collective environment with respect to
Yeah, thank you for those questions. The first one, remind me again what the first one was.
you have to one.
Yes, okay. So that was kind of the goal with the most likely in the survey, best case scenario in the interviews, was to have this idea of like, literally if anything could be true in the future, what would you see? I think the idea of like that's what I would, I guess, say is like the idea of wanting, like, well, do we want a society where people can consume as much as they want, but climate change isn't a problem and we don't have to worry about that. So like maybe that means biodegradable materials for everything. So I think that was kind of the sort of distinction there with like the very broad like, Lorax situation of what do you possibly want in the future, and then most likely in the surveys. And in terms of your other question, that was one of my another thing I would love to do in future research as well is have that group collaborative envisioning, because I do think that if you got a group of people together and have them bounce ideas off of each other, and maybe half of them care about this issue and half of them don't, or they all do or they all don't, I think people can, come up with some really interesting ideas together, especially in like a focus group type setting. Like literally, let's have the drawing board open, just imagine whatever you want. So I do think that would be really interesting, because I do think, yeah, the one-on-one thing is cool, but having people talk to each other about it as well would be awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I would imagine you're talking with a family. What can you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like I said, I think the whole idea of in environmental courses or in business courses or, other courses that maybe touch on sustainability issues, it's one thing to like mention these topics and like tell people about the problems that the world is facing, but it's another thing to kind of involve them in a way and ask them these questions and ask them open-ended questions about, what can we do? Where are the problems? Where are the spaces where maybe we need to think creatively about keeping a certain quality of life while also, solving the problem. So I think, like I said, like having education in the sense that's more collaborative and involves these conversations rather than just talking at people and giving them the facts of life. That's definitely one way that I could see it. I mean, yeah, and then I guess moving into communities is another. Like it's another. I don't know exactly the ways in which this kind of be implemented, but I do think that this is a positive way to get people to think about the issue. But yeah.
Good job. I know it's a little stressful, so feel free to